So tell me, David, what do we need to know when we're working in a region about the local farm context and the industry?
Okay, so the type of farming system is very important. So if you're, for example, a continuous cropper, you pretty much are locked into a seasonal cycle where, you have to get ready for seeding, get seeding undertaken, and then you start to move into a monitoring and control phase for your crop. So that involves a lot of time on boom sprays and tractors, and then you go into harvest. And often after harvest, then it's the time for farmers to do some tidying up, relax, go on holidays, go fishing, do whatever. Those who are in a mixed farming system have a little bit more requirement over the whole year to manage their livestock. And they have to fit in things like shearing in amongst their cropping operations. I guess a situation like this, where we are looking at tree crops, the needs are going to be different, and also the time commitment. So generally speaking, those with extensive cropping operations tend to have expensive, big equipment, so they need big acreages, they need capital investment, they often carry a lot of debt, so there's an inherent risk factor, and also at risk of a crop failure. So, you can put in a crop and it costs a lot of money to put a crop in, and you can totally lose it if conditions turned out adverse. So, just understanding what's the size of the operation? What is their main system? What's their main focus? So even within mixed crop farming systems, you can have a farmer who's more focused on the cropping component compared to the livestock, but you can also have vice versa. So particularly when you're organising events, field days and those sorts of things, you need to have an understanding of what's happening in that district within that type of farming system. The other thing which comes up is that different industries place different pressures and have different requirements on their farmers. So if, for example, you're in a system like this, there's got to be some quality control measures which are going to be different to, say, quality control measures in a cropping situation.
Which will depend on who the industry body is and how well established they are. I mean, this is Davidson Plum we have here on Banyula. So what industry bodies do they fit underneath? Obviously, there's horticultural innovations. But also on this farm, you've got macadamias over there, which have the Australian Macadamia Society. And then they also have cattle, and then they're also linked in with New South Wales farmers. So all of those different organisations. But of course, some of those industry bodies, some of those are more around advocacy for farming as well.
Yeah, and because we're on a regenerative farm and we talk about regenerative systems, industry places some constraints on about how we can utilise less intrusive practices. So, for example, grain quality control absolutely doesn't want insects within the grain. And so in a lot of cases, you have to use pesticides. You have no choice. So industry itself can put constraints on practices which farmers can or can't use. And we need to be aware of that.
And in the case of then organic grains industries, how do they manage that?
Well, organic grain industries are generally much smaller niche industries. A key focus is on, weed contamination. So, they don't want contamination with non-grain specific species. They don't want insects. And a lot of what you actually earn is based or influenced on protein levels. So we look at protein, which means you've got to keep your nitrogen applications up. So it's a completely different ballgame to, say, an organic system.
And in terms of the organic systems, there's a different situation of rules, regulations and processes for certification, many of which actually rely on international expectations of farmers. So you might have your national bodies and industry bodies, and you also might have international expectations if you're wanting to export your products as well.
Yeah, that's right. And I guess the other thing about farm context is that if you're in a larger operation, that tends to mean that you actually have less community around you. So
Larger areas between farms.
large areas between farms. So, there are travel considerations to be considered. But it all comes down to, if you're in an area with very few farms, largely scattered, you're not going to be able to cover the same area so quickly as well. You need to factor that into your estimates of how long
Exactly.
it's going to take.
Yeah, same as when we were doing the work on developing the surveys on the Eyre Peninsula. We had a couple of meeting points and further up and further down the Eyre Peninsula, and still farmers were driving up to 4 hours to come to that meeting point.
Yeah, exactly. And, the type of enterprise really influences a whole range of factors well beyond the fact, well, do I harvest grain or do I sell livestock?
Exactly, and particularly, how would you say that works in relation to markets?
Okay, yeah, so there's quite a lot of market influence now, which probably wasn't there 20, 30 years ago. So there's a lot more grain marketers out there working as private businesses, supporting farmers. But it does appear that there is going to be a consumer-driven shift looking at grain quality more than just, say, protein levels, as an example. It's certainly already occurred in livestock, where we've seen a reduction in fat scoring and levels required.
As consumer expectations change around a whole range of factors.
Yes, and I guess one of the things we talk about with regenerative agriculture is, can we build increased resilience to not just climate factors, but also market changes?
Absolutely. So when you are dependent on a particular source, I know that farmers, when I was working in the Wimmera, not so long ago, farmers were talking about the impact of rising nitrogen prices and ammonia. So they were, according to the group I was doing that workshop with, people were trying rotational cropping again. So they were starting to try different practices because they recognised that there was this vulnerability to the price of nitrogen, and that links in with things that are well outside of people's control. The Ukraine war driving up the price of oil, because it's heavily dependent on energy to create that ammonia, leading those prices to go up, and those kind of fluctuations.
That's right. And I guess with nitrogen as a specific example, is that the price basically doubled. And when that was the single biggest fertiliser input cost, we went from, in some cases, $50 to $100 a hectare up to $200 and $250 a hectare straight away, before you got any return whatsoever. And, there are some farmers whose input costs now to grow a crop are in the region of $400 to $500 a hectare. So if you put in 2,000 hectares, there's a lot riding on getting a return.
Yeah, and in your view, how might that be? What are the other options? How could you build resilience in relation to your the N that's going into your system? How can you reduce those inputs?
Okay, so regenerative farming concepts, I think the principles been known and understood for quite a long time. However, there is a shortage of scientific and technical data to support some of the ways to achieve these principles.
Yeah, but I do know you've been involved in some projects around this, and it's not published yet, but what kind of things have been emerging from that research? Okay,
so you already mentioned increasing legume component in rotations, and that does seem to be providing benefit. I've recently had some experience with some landholders who are undersowing cereals with a legume and then removing the legume mid-season, so we don't get competition at the end of the season for water
when it's really
in particular.
Dry.
And we seem to be able to be cut down on nitrogen applications considerably. But one of the other ways over my working life is we're seeing more and more farmers using nitrogen nutrition in crop rather than putting it all up front.
Yeah.
So this reduces the risk, and it means that they can then tailor their inputs a little bit better depending on, more understanding of what the season's going to do or what it has done. And I guess one of the other things which is becoming more apparent is farmers are relying more on weather forecasting. So there has been quite a lot of interesting work looking at the accuracy of seasonal forecasting.
Yeah.
But that varies depending on the region.
Well, yeah, I mean, it was the number one information source on the Eyre Peninsula, apart from other farmers.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it is very important. they certainly try to keep on their toes, the farmers down there. So in that regard, I mean, what we're on here, we're in Banyula, which is a regenerative farm in the Northern Rivers region of New South Wales, and we have mixed enterprises here. We've got Davidson plum, we've got the cattle, we've got macadamias. There's also remnant rainforests and some koala habitat being developed. So, what would you say, coming out here, stepping out from the Eyre Peninsula, what are some of the main differences in the way that the industries intersect in a farm that's got, say, lots of different things going on compared to a farm that might just have one or two?
Okay, so obviously in this region, you've already mentioned a range of different enterprise and land uses. Let's say you're in a 250 rainfall district on Eyre Peninsula or Western Australia. Your options are pretty limited to broadacre systems. So when we talk broadacre systems, it's either cropping or livestock or a mixture of both. And that's pretty much it. And that itself brings restrictions because depending on water availability and cost of water, that will influence your livestock capacity. But also your landscape has a major influence too. So in Eyre Peninsula, where we've got dune swale systems, for example, we've got sand dunes, which are potentially highly erosive. That's where livestock tend to camp and congregate. So for some farmers, a real problem because, you've got difficult livestock management, particularly if you're in a cropping rush time of year, where, you're 2, 3, 4 weeks on the header or on a cedar. You really don't want to be bothered with shifting livestock every couple of days.
So, because that's what you have here. There's rotational, there's time control grazing. So they're moving cows. As soon as that grass gets down to the height of a bottle of Coke, they're moving on to the next space. So that is harder to manage in the larger systems. You're saying?
Yeah, well, exactly. If you've got a 150 or 200 hectare paddock, you can potentially strip graze, but then you've got to shift water all the time. And we're talking about a drier, hotter climate, particularly in summer. So you have to have good water security, which, again, in one of your surveys, I think water security came up as a major issue.
Yeah, absolutely. Across regions, water security is always a major issue. That's one thing that farmers have in common, understanding even if they're used to higher rainfalls, their ecosystems and crops for that region depend on those higher levels of rainfall. So all of those things can be quite relative. And so I guess, that comes down to some of the ideas of regenerative agriculture itself. Some ideas are not going to work necessarily everywhere, or if they are going to work in a different region, you're going to have to think about all of the other constraints that might come with them.
Yeah, and some of the larger operations, getting suitable staff is a major issue. And even when we talk about, say, the remoteness of Eyre Peninsula, a lot of education is done well off of the local area. So, we've got a lot of kids sent to Adelaide for education or sent down to the larger towns for education. So they're not there to assist on farm constantly. And so that affects the landholder's decision making about what can I actually take on? And that comes down to a really important concept, is not just time constraints on farmers in doing the operation, but it's time constraint on farmers to actually think and plan and adapt and adopt new principles. So one of the key things is that we can run a field day, or you can design a field day, which may be really important, have some really good information for farmers, but still have relatively poor attendance, because if that day happens to be a very good spraying day, that comes first because, it's the immediate thing which hits them between the eyes, and that's what they've got to go to, even though in the long term, what they've missed out on probably could end up costing a lot more.
Things like that, as we had discussed in the knowledge sharing meetings that we've had in the project, that can also be an opportunity. I know that the birch cropping group had the bog field days, and they managed to bring together 300 odd farmers in one day, just because people were they were getting stuck in the mud and they needed some strategies to deal with that. So it can also be an opportunity for engagement as well.
Yeah, and you've hit a really good point, is that some immediate threat will draw people in. And one thing a lot of farmers have moved to is to have private consulting agronomists.
Yeah.
And the agronomist's role is mainly there as a problem solver, but immediate problem solver. In a lot of cases, they're not necessarily thinking about a long-term systems approach, because that's not what they're really paid for.
Often paid year to year. We've definitely discussed this in a few different regions.
Yeah, so, that's one thing to consider is there anything else which is happening at the time, which is likely to affect people's attention engagement. But again, this longer term learning, particularly if you're looking at changing, minor changes to a system, like say changing your herbicide use or the time of spraying, or changing a fertiliser, they're generally very easily adopted and accepted quite quickly. However, if you're looking
because they fit within the paradigm that people are already used to.
Yes. But
the way of looking at things, sorry.
But they're used to it, and it's comfortable and easy to shift. Whereas more complex and strategic operation changes,
like multi-species pasture cropping,
they take a lot longer. Multi-species is not so bad, but certainly I was around long enough to know when stubble retention and no-till was first being introduced. That took, a few years. Eyre Peninsula adopted in South Australia much quicker than some other areas in South Australia due to these other constraints which I've talked about. But, the one thing about training and extension and engagement with farmers is, is this fun to do, or is it just a pain in the backside? So, one thing I would never do is run a training or extension event when there's a major clearing sale in a district. So I know where the farmers will be. They'll be at the clearing sale. Because they like to look and see what other people have got. There might be something which they can pick up which is useful to them, but it also is a really good social opportunity.
Absolutely. And if there are events that want to bring in different ages of farmers or different demographics, more women, it's around thinking, well, what's a time of day or a time of week that's going to work for them and their other responsibilities as well. So, particularly people with young children, that's a big element that we found across farming regions. That, and I know this, I'm a mother of 2 young kids, you've met them, you are more time poor. You are managing a farm, you're managing a business, you're growing your crops and taking care of your livestock and your children as well, and managing all of that. So trying to find a time that's family friendly can be another important element. If people are wanting to bring in farmers of that family demographic. Yeah, and certainly we shouldn't underestimate that social engagement process, because farming is essentially a lonely business. You can sit on a boom spray day after day after day with only yourself and the radio for company. So it's good sometimes to get out and get them talking and socialising. And quite often, you'll set a workshop and you'll try and keep it short, serve a point and that sort of thing. And farmers will appreciate that. And then they'll spend the next hour sitting around having a yak in the car park. Which is really important, and kind of what we sort of lost with COVID and online engagement. It's really important. I think it's fairly well agreed across all sectors of society that a short meeting is a good meeting is a short meeting, but actually allowing for that time around it for that social engagement, or something that's optional and afterwards that people can do to bring people in. Because when you do have regions that are much more sparsely populated, you've got larger farm size. I know that's the case across many Australian farming systems. Certainly it was the case in the Western Downs, where the sports clubs were a major connector, but also certainly on the Eyre Peninsula and in big parts of the Central West as well. It's people want to have those social engagements much of the time, but at the same time they're also busy and time poor. So it's a constant balance, I guess.
Yeah, it's a juggle, and I guess the number one thing is that farmers learn by doing and looking. So if we look at, say, the Kolb learning cycle, which I've looked at some years ago, and we actually had a group of close to 30 farmers actually sit through a test, it really showed that there's a strong focus on learning by doing.
Yeah, practicing, giving it a crack, trying something a little bit different.
Yep.
Experimenting, yeah.
And that's why, if you can actually, rather than sit in a room talking to farmers and having your usual PowerPoint presentations and blah, blah, which are all okay, but actually do it with association, with something which they can visually see, touch, feel, and discuss, it tends to work a lot better.
And certainly we found that in the social benchmarking data from the soil CRC surveys, there's farmers like to see that local success. They love to see that evidence, and they also love to hear from their neighbours, from other farmers. They want to sort of hear it from the horse's mouth, so to speak, a lot of the time, and that way they can allow them to have those conversations that help to build their understanding and their confidence in trying something different.
Yeah.
And ultimately, building those relationships over the long run as well is a really important part of it.
Yeah. So basically, extension engagement is really about supporting development of confidence.
Yes. And
it's not disgorging a whole heap of information at them.
Yeah.
It's whatever you think will work to deliver interest, but also confidence to give it a go.
Yeah, exactly.
And farmers are really good at giving a go if they don't think it's a waste of time.